Rudyard Kipling, the British writer, poet, and chronicler of imperial destiny, called it the Great Game, the game for control over the crossroads of Central Asia, over the wild tribes of the mountains, Afghanistan. For 150 years, the British made sure the Russian Empire never gained control of Afghanistan. For centuries, it was the gateway to India. Across the Khyber Pass came Alexander the Great's Macedonian army and the Mongol invaders of Genghis Khan. And then, in 1979, the Red Army. Today, as ever, Afghanistan is strategically important. It is on the route to the Persian Gulf, close to Iran, and shares a 1,500-mile border with the Islamic country of Pakistan, heavily armed by its closest ally, the United States. The Great Game is still being played.
In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with the goal of overthrowing Hafizullah Amin and installing a more compliant communist government. This marked the beginning of a nearly decade-long struggle between the Soviets and Mujahideen fighters who resisted Soviet attempts to solidify control. The Soviets sought not only to restore full power to the communist regime, but also to suppress the rise of radical Islam in the region, which they saw as a threat to their influence. The new Soviet-backed leader, Babrak Kemal, promised reforms including freedom of religion, but these promises were met with deep distrust by many Afghans, particularly with the soon-to-be Mujahideen fighters. Moreover, the communist government's efforts to grant women more rights, such as the right to education, the right to marriage, the right to vote, and the right to have control over their bodies, further inflamed tensions in the isolated Islamic communities. This resistance helped to fuel the Mujahideen's cause, as many saw these reforms as direct threats to their religious and cultural traditions. Afghanistan was often viewed as a fragmented, tribal state, but this view oversimplified the reality. Despite the country's tribal divisions, Islam served as a major unifying force, connecting these groups in their resistance to both the Soviets and to the perceived threat of their way of life. During the Soviet-Afghan War, a cascade of leadership changes and shifting political priorities in the USSR shaped the course of the conflict. In 1982, Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev's death brought Yuri Andropov to power, a leader committed to continuing the Afghan campaign. However, Andropov's hospitalization with kidney complications weakened his leadership, and after his death in 1984, a troika briefly took control, until Konstantin Chernenko assumed office. Chernenko's brief tenure ended with his death in 1985, ushering in Mikhail Gorbachev, a reform-minded leader whose policies of glasnost and perestroika marked a dramatic shift in the Politburo. These leadership shifts and policy changes in the USSR not only influenced the Soviet exit from Afghanistan, but also signaled the coming end of the Cold War, as Gorbachev's reforms opened the USSR up to major transformation. By 1988, Gorbachev viewed the war as unwinnable and costly, and thus initiated the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was completed in early 1989. With the end of the nearly decade-long war, Afghanistan was plunged into a brutal civil war as post-Mujahideen factions fought over minor religious differences and vied for control of the war-torn state. The Soviet-Afghan War became a striking example of the clash between conventional and guerrilla warfare tactics. With the Soviet Union equipped with highly mechanized military equipment, it relied on large-scale assaults, heavy artillery, and advanced air support, especially with the Mi-24 helicopter gunships, which became a symbol of the war. Their doctrine emphasized capturing and holding key areas to control the territory, assuming that dominating the ground would suppress resistance. However, the Mujahideen fighters operated in stark contrast, leveraging Afghanistan's rugged and mountainous terrain and utilizing guerrilla tactics that prioritized mobility, surprise, and knowledge of the local landscape. They conducted ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks, often targeting Soviet supply lines and outposts. This asymmetric warfare exploited Soviet weaknesses, nullifying much of the advantage of mechanized forces in the challenging Afghan terrain, forcing Soviet forces into a prolonged and exhausting war. This clash of doctrines exposed the limitations of conventional strategy in irregular warfare, and highlighted the resilience of guerrilla tactics in the face of a technologically superior enemy, setting the stage for a long, grinding conflict that favored the defensive posture of the Mujahideen. With the brutal clash of military doctrines during the Soviet-Afghan War, Pakistan was thrust into a significant humanitarian role, bearing the impact of the widespread displacement of Afghans. As Soviet forces and the Mujahideen fighters fought the nearly decade-long conflict, the toll on Afghan civilians was devastating. By late 1984, an estimated 10,000 Soviet troops had died alongside 50,000 Mujahideen fighters, and 500,000 Afghan civilians were dead or wounded, forcing over 3 million Afghans to flee primarily to Pakistan, with the American National Security Advisor giving a speech to Afghan refugees in Pakistan.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again. But your cause is right and God is on your side.
The influx of refugees into Pakistan created enormous social, economic, and political challenges. Camps sprang up along the Afghan-Pakistan border, straining Pakistan's resources and public services as they struggled to provide basic necessities like food, water, shelter, and medical care. The crowded refugee camps in areas such as Peshawar and the northwest provinces faced deteriorating conditions, and tensions between local communities and refugees began to rise. Resources were stretched thin, leading to health crises and educational gaps, and intensifying Pakistan's economic burden in already underdeveloped regions. Politically, the refugee crisis transformed Pakistan's role in the region. Domestically, the presence of millions of refugees put significant strain on Pakistani infrastructure and national security, complicating governance, while internationally Pakistan's involvement exposed it to greater scrutiny and risk of a Soviet retaliation. Furthermore, the refugee influx contributed to a dramatic cultural shift in the border regions as traditional Afghan communities and their Islamic values influenced the local population. Over time, this dynamic contributed to the growth of radicalized Islam within Pakistan, which would have lasting effects on regional stability well after the war. In navigating these challenges, Pakistan's experience as a frontline state in the Soviet-Afghan conflict underscored the immense humanitarian cost of the war and the far-reaching impact it had on the neighboring countries.
American interests on the front line pretty much depend on one man, a military dictator. In many ways, Zia has become the Shah of Iran to us, our new best friend in this part of the world. Will he last longer than the Shah? Does he really speak for the people of Pakistan? Hard to tell. If the people of Pakistan speak out against Zia, they're thrown into jail.
America's acceptance of Mohammad Zia al-Haq's authoritarian regime in Pakistan is a clear example of the lengths the US was willing to go to counter Soviet influence during the Cold War. For the US, halting this expansion was essential. Allowing a communist government so close to the oil-rich Middle East could reshape the region's power balance. As a result, the US looked to Pakistan, Afghanistan's immediate neighbor, for strategic support, even though Pakistan at the time was under the military dictatorship of Zia al-Haq. Despite concerns over Zia's authoritarian rule, the US prioritized its Cold War objectives and saw Zia as an indispensable ally. Supporting Zia's regime was not an easy ideological decision for the United States. Here was a leader who had seized power in a military coup, imposed strict martial law, and ruled with little regard for democratic processes. Nevertheless, the US made the strategic decision to overlook these factors in favor of securing Pakistan as a frontline state against the Soviet Union. Zia's Pakistan became the staging ground for an intense covert operation to arm and fund the Afghan Mujahideen. This was part of the larger US strategy of containment aimed at preventing the further spread of Soviet influence. Despite the clear conflicts with its own values, the US provided not just moral support, but significant financial and military resources. The CIA claimed to spend $75 million a year into Pakistan to support the Mujahideen and Pakistan's own military. This aid was channeled through Pakistan's intelligence services and made the US-Pakistan alliance an essential aspect of the war. Pakistan became a hub for logistical and training support, with CIA agents, military trainers, and vast quantities of weaponry flowing across the Afghan border. By working through Pakistan's intelligence services, particularly the ISI, American funds provided sophisticated weaponry, including the now infamous Stinger missiles, which allowed Mujahideen fighters to target Soviet aircraft with remarkable success. The flow of money and resources helped turn the tide of the war, making it increasingly costly and challenging for the Soviets to maintain their occupation of Afghanistan. This partnership also came with regional and long-term consequences. Supporting Zia and arming the Mujahideen meant the US had to accept, and in some cases even encourage, Pakistan's approach to religious and political radicalization as tools of war. Zia's regime was heavily influenced by Islamic conservatism, and Pakistan's support of religiously motivated fighters fostered the growth of radical groups. The US, focused solely on its immediate objective of countering Soviet influence, paid little attention to the potential fallout, including the radicalization of militant groups that would later influence regional and global security. America's alignment with Zia's Pakistan thus illustrates the compromises it made and the ideological sacrifices undertaken to counter Soviet expansionism. Ultimately, the US decided to back Zia's authoritarian regime in Pakistan, demonstrated the intense fear of Soviet influence during the Cold War. This alliance, however complex, was a defining feature of the Soviet-Afghan War and highlighted the US's readiness to compromise on its democratic ideals for the sake of strategic gain. This cooperation helped drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan, but it also left lasting repercussions, shaping the political and security scene in the region for decades to come. Domestically, the Soviet Union's strategy of withholding information from its citizens during the Afghan War had profound social, economic, and political consequences. The regime's censorship meant that many citizens were unaware of the true scale and nature of the conflict, leading to a significant disconnect between the government's narrative and the realities on the ground. This misinformation not only created a largely uninformed public, but also fostered skepticism and disillusionment as the war dragged on, revealing the stark contrast between official propaganda and the experiences of soldiers and their families. Economically, this war placed immense strain on the Soviet economy, which was already burdened by the inefficiencies and stagnations of communism. The government allocated substantial resources to the military effort in Afghanistan, diverting funds from critical areas such as healthcare, education, and consumer goods. As casualties mounted and the realities of war became increasingly apparent, public dissatisfaction grew. Families of soldiers faced financial hardships, with many struggling to support themselves after losing their loved one or receiving little to no information about their whereabouts or well-being. This lack of transparency exacerbated the public's frustration with the regime, contributing to a growing sense of alienation from the state. Politically, the Soviet leadership's manipulation of information and recruitment practices fostered resentment among the populace. Many conscripts were misled about the nature of the conflict, and being told that they were engaging in a peacekeeping mission rather than an aggressive military occupation. As news of rising casualties trickled back home, calls for accountability grew louder. This discontent began to manifest in protests and dissent, further weakening the already fragile legitimacy of the Communist Party. The disconnect between the government's portrayal of the war and the experience of ordinary citizens ultimately contributed to the broader atmosphere of reform that emerged in the late 80s, culminating in Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. These reforms aimed to address public grievances, but also opened the floodgates for greater criticism of the government, setting the stage for significant political change in the eventual dissolution of the USSR. The Soviet-Afghan War had deep cultural impacts on the USSR and the post-Soviet states, shaping art, music, and public sentiment. Several bands emerged from the experiences of soldiers and the broader Soviet public, capturing the emotional toll and disillusionment brought about by the conflict. One of the most famous songs to emerge from the era, Gorbakovi, Blood Type by Kino, resonates beyond the Afghan conflict, capturing a broader discontent that resonated with Soviet youth. It became an anthem for a generation shaped by war and the socio-political uncertainty that surrounded it. The song's themes of identity, sacrifice, and existential questioning struck a chord with listeners, reflecting both the literal struggles of war and a metaphorical quest for meaning during a period of Soviet decline. The song Swallowing Dust reflects the haunting and devastating realities of the Soviet-Afghan War through visceral lyrics that speak about the experiences of soldiers trapped in a brutal conflict. Yet another example of the profound cultural, social, and political impacts of the war, both in the Soviet Union and in Afghanistan. This song vividly captures the physical and psychological toll of war, the sense of isolation, and the inevitability of death for many soldiers. The song Ask the Desert poignantly reflects the psychological and physical toll the Soviet-Afghan War had on the soldiers, offering a raw account of the relentless struggles faced in the unforgiving Afghan landscapes. The song encapsulates the cultural, emotional, and social impacts the war had on both Soviet soldiers and the broader Soviet society. Shakvadak, often sung to express the confusion and fear associated with guerrilla warfare in the Afghan mountains. The name Shakvadak itself is referring to a mountainous region in Afghanistan, which became symbolic of the hardship and unpredictability that characterized the unprepared Soviet forces there. One of the most impactful songs of the war was We Are Leaving, Farewell Mountains by Khaskad. It expresses the bittersweet relief of troops as they began their withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1988. Known for its somber, almost mournful tone, it encapsulates the collective feeling of loss, grief, and fatigue as the soldiers left behind their comrades, showing that it would leave a lasting impact on many for decades to come. Together, these songs not only provided the soundtrack for this documentary, but also an outlet for a generation of Soviet youth grappling with the trauma and disillusionment of the Soviet-Afghan War. They offered a raw and authentic perspective that contrasted sharply with official Soviet narratives, creating a space for mourning and ultimately a subtle form of protest against the failing Soviet system, leaving its lasting impact on both Soviet and post-Soviet society.
This is the tank commander. His identity card, a man from Moscow. The Mujahideen rarely take prisoners. A sergeant from Tashkent in Uzbekistan, a Muslim land incorporated into the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Their cards and bodies and photographs are scattered now across the land they invaded. The poet of another invader, Rudyard Kipling, wrote this: "When you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come to cut up your remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains, and go to your God like a soldier." And for their God, Allah, the Mujahideen fight on, fighting to hold back the worlds of the infidels. Poor people, they had two things, their land and their God. Their land may be taken from them, the perimeter of contention between giants. So they are left with their faith and their holy war.
Востока.